Good evening and welcome to 100 Debates on the Environment for the Barrie-Innisfil Federal Riding. My name is Deborah McGrath and I'm honored to be your moderator. Before we commence, in the spirit of democracy and truth and reconciliation, the Innisfil Public Library acknowledges and thanks the First Peoples of this territory and other Indigenous peoples for sharing this land in order for us to continue our work today. This debate was spearheaded by GreenPAC, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to elect and support environmental leaders of all major parties running for office. It is co-sponsored by the Simcoe County Greenbelt Coalition and the Innisfil Idea Lab and Library, and made possible by the many staff and volunteers you see here tonight. This non-partisan debate is being live streamed by Rogers TV Barrie and runs until 9 p.m. Let's quickly review the format. Please note that all 5 official parties were invited. The PPC candidate, Ms. Stephanie Robinson, declined our invitation. Tonight, after my introduction, we are going to hear from each of the candidates. They will have 1 minute to introduce themselves. We then move into 6 preset questions, 4 of which are from 100 Debates, and 2 of them are local. We then have wild cards. The candidates can choose to rebut any of the 6 preset questions if they so desire. After that, we have audience questions. Time permitting, we hope to fit in more than 4. If you have your cards already, please make sure you fill them out. If not, the table is at the back. Finally, there will be concluding remarks from each of the 2 minutes for each of the candidates, and I will have 2 minutes to wrap up. As with every event, there are some rules, and I'd like to review them now. For everyone, a reasonable decorum is expected to ensure a fair and equitable discussion. We take the security and respect of our candidates and guests very seriously. The speaking order was chosen randomly before the debate began, and to maintain decorum, candidates were also briefed on points of order. Again, pre-printed audience cards can be found at the back of the room. If you wish to ask a question, there's your criteria. They will be chosen at random. Please follow the criteria listed. And this is a tough one, folks. In the interest of time, because we are live streaming and there is a lot packed in tonight, please withhold your applause until the end of the debate. Alphabetically, I would like to introduce our candidates. They will do so themselves in a moment. Tonight we have Mr. John Broussard, Conservative Party, Ms. Bonnie North, Green Party, Ms. Lisa Marie Wilson from the Liberal Party, and Mr. Pekka Rainio from the NDP Party. This is a non-partisan event. Welcome to 100 Debates on the Environment. Let's get started. Our first question is on climate change. Introductions open. I'm sorry. Thank you. Introductory statements. Thank you. 1 minute per candidate. Thank you, Lisa Marie. We're going to start with Ms. Wilson.
Thank you all for allowing me to be here and speak about this very important issue. Climate change is not an abstract concept. It is a very real issue that affects all of our lives. My name is Lisa Marie Wilson, and I am proud to be a part of the Liberal team, as we have a plan to fight climate change that's ambitious and serious. In past 4 years, we've done more to fight climate change than any other federal government in Canada's history, and there is lots more to do. This election is critical for the environment, and all of the progress would be undone if Andrew Scheer is elected. We have the only credible plan to fight climate change, and we know what it takes to get the job done. We have already stepped up to protect our oceans, ban single-use plastics, and put a price on pollution. and we have plans to do so much more. Do we want to elect Andrew Scheer, who promised to roll back carbon pricing his first day in office? A vote for me, for Lisa Marie, is a vote for a strong voice and advocate in Ottawa who won't stop ensuring our Liberal government does all it has planned locally and promised globally.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. Ms. North.
So on March the 10th, 2018, Keenan Aylwin, Lynn Therian, and I organized a Kinder Morgan pipeline protest at Five Corners in Barrie. And we were doing this because across the country on that one day, we were acting in solidarity with First Nations in British Columbia who were protesting the lack of protection of their land and their water if Kinder Morgan is to be expanded. And nationally, thousands of people stepped up. But unfortunately, locally, despite being widely promoted on social media, less than a dozen people showed up, and one of those people was a heckler. So it was amazing that just over a year and a half later, we had more than 600 people show up downtown. And while we didn't get a lot of support in 2018, we are happy that everyone here now is on the same page. Let's get to work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. North. Mr. Broussard.
Thank you, Deb. First of all, let me begin by saying that I think none of us in this room would disagree with the fact that man-made climate change is real and that it is happening. This is a significant challenge, not just here at home in Canada, but around the world. And what we're seeing, unfortunately, is a lot of political posturing that's going on, and we need to make sure that we all work together as a nation to not just meet the challenges that are here at home, but also the challenges that exist globally. There's no monopoly on a good idea when we deal with the issue of climate change. It doesn't matter to me, and it shouldn't matter to anyone, whether it's a Liberal idea, an NDP idea, a Green Party idea, or a Conservative idea. All of those ideas should be taken into account when we're formulating a plan to deal with man-made climate change. And I think that we need to work together as Canadians to not just deal with the issue here at home, but also to take the fight globally as well.
Thank you, Mr. Broussard. Mr. Rainio.
Hey, it's so nice to be back here at the Innisfil Library. You know, when I first moved to Innisfil over 20 years ago, this building wasn't here. All that was in Alcona was the coffee shop up the street, and they were putting in an Alcona Glen School. You might recall, though, that across the street from the school was a beautiful wetland. Well, the students and I at Alcona Glen used to go to that wetland to do some science experiments and do some exploration, and we were very concerned when the town decided to develop that piece of property. And so we decided to form a green team. We created petitions. We had speakers come in from the Lake Simcoe Conservation Authority. And I think, if I recall correctly, we made a deputation at the town to try to protect that wetland. You know, that was a beginning of my environmental activism here in Innisfil and Barrie, and I've continued on since, holding many events, such as our climate change event here in June with the David Suzuki Foundation. I'm hoping to be your MP in Ottawa and be a strong voice for our Lake Simcoe watershed, our lake, and for climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rainio. Our introductory statements are done. Thank you all. We're moving on to the first question, and I might remind the audience that these questions were received by the candidates well in advance. Question number 1 is on climate change. Could we go back one slide, please, Jessica? Around the world, we are seeing inspiring examples of leadership to reduce greenhouse gas, or GHG, pollution and accelerate the shift to a green economy. As well, we are seeing a ramp up of the effects of climate change, and the scientific consensus is that we have little more than a decade to turn things around. In fact, Canadians produce the most GHG of all G20 industrialized nations, nearly 3 times the average, and 8 tons per person. Given the enormous financial and environmental impact of GHG pollution, we are experiencing extreme weather events such as wildfires, flooding, and droughts. Question: what will you do as an MP to ensure we have a safe climate? What are the key elements of an action plan to ensure Canada meets its internal obligations to reduce GHG pollution? We're going to start with Mr. Rainio, please.
Thank you. Hey, I'm very proud of our very bold climate change action plan that the NDP has put forward. We will legislate science-based targets to try to keep warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius. I follow, as does the NDP, the writings of Naomi Klein. You might have read her seminal work, This Changes Everything. From that document, we got the LEAP Manifesto and then the Green New Deal that's taking over in the States and here in Ontario. And Naomi Klein says that we need to tackle the twin crises going on. We cannot tackle climate change in isolation. Otherwise, we risk incremental changes through greenwashing for decades to come. We need to tackle inequality and climate change together. We've all been out door knocking, the four of us, for months now, and we know that many, many people in Barrie and Innisfil cannot make ends meet. People can't think about putting solar panels on their roof when they can't even keep a roof over their head. People can't think about purchasing an electric vehicle when they can't even get food on their table. We must address growing inequality. We must provide good-paying jobs in a low-carbon future and leave no one behind. And that is our plan in our NDP Climate Change Action Plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rainio. Next, Mr. Brassard.
Thank you, Deb. Canada's Conservatives are absolutely committed to the Paris targets, but we believe that the best approach to reach those targets are through technology, not taxes. And our plan is to invest in technology by incentivizing companies that want to look to Canada to create the technology that we needed by lowering corporate tax rates as they go through the patent process. And then as they go through the commercialization process of those technologies, then we as a Canadian government can help to mitigate the impacts and use that technology elsewhere around the world through our Canadian Clean brand. Now, we as Canadians are doing our part. We're doing a significant amount, but as Deb said, we represent a small percentage of greenhouse gas emissions around the world. So by using our Canadian Clean brand, our Canadian Clean technology, by helping companies export Canadian ingenuity, innovation, and technology around the world, we can help lower what is a global problem, not just a Canadian problem, but a global problem around the world. And we can do that, for example, with carbon capture technology and other technologies that have yet to be developed. It's the job of the Canadian government to make sure that we provide an environment so that those technologies can be created, and that's why our program focuses on technology and not taxes.
Thank you, Mr. Brassard. Ms. North.
So Greens believe in overcoming the status quo political games. We need to have all hands on deck to deal with this problem because the scope is so broad and the stakes are so high. So we need to cooperate across party lines. We don't need to just say we're going to do it. We need to do it. And we want to work towards emissions targets that are in line with the recommendations of the climate scientists and the benchmarks of the Paris Accord. And we want to fundamentally adjust our priorities to achieve a dramatic change. So we're going to set stricter targets where 60% of greenhouse gas emissions, which were at the 2005 level, are reduced, and we do that by 2030, and we want to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And in the meantime, set declining legal emissions for industries as well. We also want to look at carbon pricing as a broad-based revenue-neutral carbon fee on all sources of carbon dioxide, and the dividends would be returned to Canadians. And finally, we want no new fossil fuel projects. We're going to cancel the Trans Mountain Pipeline. We're going to end fossil fuel subsidies and 100% renewable energy by 2030.
Thank you, Ms. North. Ms. Wilson.
We have put a price on pollution and have put all the revenue back into the people and the communities. We are phasing out coal by 2030 while investing in renewable power like wind and solar, making sure the transition away from coal is fair for workers and communities. Retrofitting 1.5 million homes, doubling the amount of nature protected, banning single-use plastics, and in our new platform, having net zero emissions by 2050. investing $3 billion to plant 2 billion trees by 2030 and increase carbon stored in nature. Money to convert transit and school buses to zero emissions. Cut tax corporations for a zero emissions technology.
Thank you, Ms. North. For the benefit of our audience, we have 1 minute to pose these questions, and each of the candidates has just a minute 30 to answer them. So the timing is tight. We're going to move on to our second question, and it's about water. Our country has the longest coastline in the world, is home to roughly half of the world's lakes, an equivalent volume of the world's fresh water, and roughly 1/4 of the world's wetlands. The Insurance Bureau of Canada has noted that climate change, as well as the historic loss of wetlands, has led to a massive 250% increase in flooding over the past 2 decades, and a reduction in water quality and wildlife habitat. Question: how can the federal government work with municipalities and farmers to reduce water pollution and the risk of flood events aggravated by industrial development and climate change? And I'm going to start with Ms. Wilson, please.
Water and flood. We introduced we're going to invest the $2 billion disaster mitigation and adaptation fund to help communities prepare for climate change through resilient infrastructure, and commit an additional $1 billion. We're committed to new measures to support people coping with disaster, including the EI Disaster Assistance Benefit, new national flood insurance, pool and completion of the flood maps. New Nature Climate Fund's commitments will continue the work with farmers and municipalities storing carbon and protecting biodiversity while supporting our economic growth.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. Ms. North.
So we believe water is sacred, and safe drinking water must be treated as a human right. It's unconscionable that so many First Nations communities do not have drinkable water, and Grassy Narrows is a shame on the province of Ontario. So we need much more collaboration between orders of government on water issues. We want to create a Council of Canadian Governments. It's a new forum where we can bring Indigenous governments, municipal governments, provincial and federal governments to the table together, because nothing is ever going to be achieved and accomplished if we are all operating in silos, especially when there are overlapping issues and overlapping jurisdictions. We need voices that join together and work together. Now, we're going to develop a national water strategy to ensure safe drinking water in collaboration with all of these groups. We're going to protect 30%, a minimum, of fresh water and land by 2030. And we're going to establish a national program to restore buffer zones around waterways through tree planting and soil building, and so much more. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. North. Mr. Broussard.
Thank you, Deb. It's a terrific question, and it really speaks to the issue of mitigation and adaptation. And certainly the federal government has a role to play in this, in the partnerships and relationships with not just the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, but also the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, to ensure that we mitigate, that we adapt, and that requires infrastructure investment as well. The one thing that I would say, though, with respect to farmers, and I think this is a key point to make, farmers are the stewards of the land. They make a living off of ensuring that they protect and that they adapt and that they mitigate a lot of the challenges that exist, and farmers are doing that in a great way. And so I think the farming community, particularly here in Innisfil, has a say in this. But I know that our real plan for the environment speaks specifically to managing our wetlands, and I'll read from it so that it's clear, and I hope I have some time. but it's supporting the completion of Canadian wetland inventory, which is going to cost about $15 million over 3 years. Study the feasibility of incentive-based programs that restore, maintains, and protects critical habitats, and assess options for maintaining, restoring critical habitats in these areas on private lands. The federal government has a role to play in mitigation and adaptation, and that comes specifically with those infrastructure investments as well.
Thank you, Mr. Broussard. Mr. Rainey.
I moved to Innisfil for 2 reasons. I was priced out of the housing market in Toronto, and I wanted to raise my kids near the lake. We see this happening everywhere in communities across southern Ontario. People moving further and further away from their roots and their workplaces just to be able to afford a home or to rent. This exodus of people is putting pressure on our municipalities, our watershed, and our lake. So we will put in place an environmental bill of rights to ensure that county growth plans are followed, and we'll provide monies to municipalities so they can have the infrastructure required to handle that growth. For example, with our water treatment plants around Lake Simcoe. Our water treatment plants are of the highest and most stringent regulations right now. However, with continued growth in our county, those same water treatment plants may be asked to take in more capacity. So for example, a water treatment plant that right now is preventing phosphates from going into the lake, they handle 20,000 homes. If we see this continued growth in our neighborhoods, they may be asked to bump up their capacity to 30,000 homes. That would mean more phosphates going into our lakes. So an environmental bill of rights would protect our lake and our watershed and prevent the deterioration of standards in our water treatment plants. So I'm very proud of our environmental plan to help municipalities maintain stringent regulations.
Thank you, Mr. Rainey. We're moving on to question 3, and there are 6 of them, folks, so buckle up. Question number 3 is about wilderness conservation. When asked what they love most about our country, Canadians point to natural beauty, wildlife, and spectacular wilderness areas. Yet we are falling below our international commitments to protect these spaces, and our parks and other protected areas are not funded at the level needed to conserve the diverse plants and animals that live there. A recent study shows that 50% of Canadian wildlife species are in decline. 94% of Canadians value the emotional and physical benefits of spending time in nature. However, 82% say that they're concerned that future generations won't have close or easy access to nature. Question: what will you do to protect the quality and quantity of wilderness in Canada? I'm going to start in the middle this time with Ms. North.
So evidence-based policy is what Greens rely upon, and we need to rely upon it to maintain the health and the lands that support us and our wildlife. And ecological wisdom is one of our 6 core values, and we believe that humans and all species are interdependent in our world, and when we degrade one of those, we degrade all of us. So we want to also work in close partnership with Indigenous peoples to rely on their traditional ecological knowledge. We want to devote $100 million a year over 4 years for Indigenous-led protected conserved areas. We want to fund stewardship of these lands and waters through our Indigenous guardians. We also want to increase fundings to Park Canada to protect ecological integrity and develop a national forest strategy which is evidence-based and works in partnership with Indigenous peoples. We also want to increase funding for federal departments for endangered species protection. We're in the 6th mass extinction right now. We're in a biodiversity crisis as well as a climate crisis, and when we lose biodiversity, we accelerate the climate crisis, and our lives are degraded as a result. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. North. Mr. Broussard.
Thank you, Deb. And Bonnie is quite right in terms of consultation, not just with Indigenous communities, but I would also add other communities to that as well, particularly hunters and anglers and those people who live off the land. Nobody knows better in terms of conservation than those three particular groups. And we've actually announced recently that the hunters and anglers will have a seat at the table to deal with issues of conservation. But again, the issue of conservation is dealt with specifically as one of 55 action items in our real plan for the environment, and it calls for the restoration of funding for the community-led National Wetland Conservation Fund, which was at $4 million a year but was cancelled. Restore funding for the community-led Recreational Fisheries Conservation Partnership, which was cancelled, and that will restore $10 million to that program. Create a new fund for community-based projects targeted to wildlife enhancement that will cost $25 million over 5 years. Maintain the community-led habitat stewardship program for species at risk, and maintain important national conservation programs, including the North American Waterfowl Management Plan and the Natural Heritage Conservation Plan. So those are things that we plan on doing with respect to conservation, but it's also important that consultation takes place with the groups that I've already mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Broussard. Ms. Wilson.
Thank you. Under the Liberal government, we have gone from protecting less than 1% of our oceans in 2015 to just under 14%. Our $1.3 billion investment in protection of nature has put Canada on track to meet our international goal for protection of biodiversity. 2020 targets were 10%, marine targets for 2020, marine 10% and 17% for terrestrial. Land and inland water have gone from 10.5% to 12.6%, and we are stepping up massive new efforts under the Nature Fund in our platform. And our new platform announces new goals of 25% protection for land and 25% protection for oceans for 2025. And in this campaign, with the goal of 30% protection for each by 2030.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. Mr. Rainio.
I love hiking and canoeing with my wife and my 2 kids throughout Simcoe County, but I read an alarming statistic last week. 1/4 of all birds in North America have disappeared since 1970. In fact, this summer I was out visiting my mom who lives in Thunder Bay, and we decided to go for a drive to our old cottage. And I remember driving to our cottage in the 1970s. When we got there, there was always a gruesome sight on our grill and windshield with tons of bugs and insects and mosquitoes and butterflies and moths. This summer, when we did that same drive, there was almost nothing. We are losing our biodiversity and our ecosystems are at risk. So we will put in place an environmental bill of rights to protect 30% of our green spaces, which will also protect our biodiversity and our ecosystems. We also have to look at growth in our county and throughout Southern Ontario and ensure that smart growth plans are in place and that they are enforced to prevent urban sprawl. We need to be building walkable communities, public transit, free public transit, high-density communities. This is how we protect our green spaces, how we protect our watershed and our lake, our wilderness areas, and our ecosystems. And our NDP climate change plan will address this and protect our ecosystems.
Thank you, Mr. Rainio. Moving on to question 4 about pollution and toxic substances. Over the last several decades, Canada has made big strides to improve the health of citizens and the environment by regulating toxic substances. Despite this effort, air pollution is still the leading environmental cause of death and illness. And Canada remains the only Western industrialized nation without legally binding national air pollution standards. In fact, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act has not been significantly strengthened in 20 years. And our laws and regulations have not kept pace with emerging threats from newer toxic substances in our environment. Question: what will you do to ensure that Canadians are better protected from the health and environmental impacts of toxic substances? I'm going to start with Ms. Wilson.
We are committed to eliminating coal by 2030, which will lead to a major reduction in mercury emissions, which is one of the most toxic substances. Our investments in green infrastructure will help reduce pollution that has made its way into our waterways. Our plan to ban single-use plastics will mean less microplastics in our environments, water sources, and food systems. The Liberal government banned the import, sale, and use and export of asbestos products containing and the manufacturing of products containing asbestos. We have committed to introducing a bill to reform the Canadian Environmental Protection Act as soon as possible.
Thank you, Ms. North. I'm sorry, thank you, Ms. Wilson. My apologies, Ms. North.
Right. So once again, we believe in using evidence to protect a healthy environment for all of us. So pollution has so many more problems than we even realize. It can contribute, and it does contribute, to chronic heart, lung, cancer, and diabetes conditions. And in addition to degrading our quality of life through those diseases, it also creates a financial burden on our healthcare system. So the environment is a financial issue as well as an environmental issue. We want to use the precautionary principle, and that is, unless we can prove that something is safe, let's not use it. So let's strengthen the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. Let's limit the approval and the use of toxic chemicals in our environment that affect us. And let's regulate microfibers as a toxic substance. And let's legislate the right to a healthy environment. And let's improve the monitoring of pesticides, including their health impacts, and reduce the use of pesticides in agriculture and support farmers in this transition, including a ban on neonics, which is damaging our pollinator populations.
Thank you, Ms. North. Mr. Broussard.
Thank you, Deb, and you're quite right that the Environmental Protection Act hasn't been upgraded since 1999, but at a time early on in Parliament, I sat on the Scrutiny of Regulations Committee, and the government does have the option to amend legislation from time to time as it relates to issues. And I can remember back in 2016, for example, the issue of asbestos and asbestos regulation was gazetted and implemented by the government, and that comes as a result of consultation and talks with stakeholder groups. But the one thing that we are going to focus on is we are absolutely going to ban the practice of dumping billions and billions of liters of raw sewage into Canada's waterways. And I think it's about time that that practice stop. We're also against wastewater dumping. Again, it's clear in our plan. And the other thing that we want to make sure that we do is also to harmonize plastic recycling standards with the provinces and working with industry to cut down on excessive packaging. So those are some of the areas that we can focus on. But again, the job of a government is to absolutely consult with stakeholders and those who have an interest in these types of issues and make sure that we act not just by a environmental protection standard or act to be created, but also those amendments that are available as well.
Thank you, Mr. Broussard. Mr. Rainio.
Yes, it's very sad to hear that our Environmental Protections Act hasn't been updated since 1999. So yes, we need to update this act. However, we also need a government that has the political will to enforce this act. You might have heard of Grassy Narrows First Nations community near Manitoba. People in Grassy Narrows have been living for decades in a community poisoned with mercury. For decades, we've seen inaction by both the Conservative and Liberal governments. In fact, the Liberals were hosting a fundraiser late last year, and a protester from Grassy Narrows held up a sign and asked Justin Trudeau if he was going to take any action. She was escorted out of the event by security, and Mr. Trudeau yelled out to her, "Thanks for your donation." It just shows how out of touch our current political leadership is. Well, we do have a strong voice for Grassy Narrows, Chief Rudy Turtle. He will be running in this upcoming election as an NDP candidate. And with his voice and with his experience, we will bring the political will to Ottawa to enforce and update the Environmental Protections Act once and for all.
Thank you, Mr. Rainio. Question number 5 is from the youth of Innisfil, and they ask that it be prefaced with this quote: "We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children." On September 18th, the library visited Nantyre High School students to discuss what environmental issues matter most to them and what they would like to ask the Barrie-Innisfil Federal Candidates. Youth discussed water, the water in Lake Simcoe, safe drinking water, water as a resource. Further, they discussed green vehicles, green space, and greenhouse gases and emissions. Here is their question: what decisions will your government make to protect the environment now so that Canada is a safe place for future generations? I'm going to start with Mr. Rainio, please.
Thanks. I'm glad I got this question ahead of time because I had made a list of our action plans. Number 1, stop all subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, and of course, we are not going to buy any more pipelines. Number 2, when it comes to decision making and climate, we will listen to science, not corporate lobbyists. Number 3, we will put all of the fossil fuel subsidies into renewable energy projects to kickstart the transition to a low carbon future. Number 4, establish an environmental bill of rights, one that is funded and one that is enforced. Number 5, we have 27 Indigenous NDP candidates running in this election. They will be at the forefront of our climate change transition because you can't address climate change without Indigenous leadership. Number 6, we're going to help municipalities move to free public transit to get people out of their cars. Number 7, help trained workers shift from fossil fuel industries to the renewable energy sector for a rapid switch to a low carbon future. Number 8, invest in low carbon local jobs like childcare and seniors care. Hey, this is a golden opportunity to fix many wrongs in our society. Tackling the twin crises of climate change and inequality, we can transform our country to a low carbon future where no one is left behind.
Thank you, Mr. Rainio. Mr. Broussard.
Thank you, Deb. And it is definitely a complicated situation by simply just transitioning into a low-carbon economy. And there are several factors that have to be taken into account. It's not a simple, idyllic flip of the switch, because there are demands that are existing around the world. And when you look domestically right now, 20%, up to 20% of our economy is based on our natural resource sector. There's 1.85 million Canadians that are employed in that sector. The clean economy represents roughly 3%, or about 360,000 jobs. So to simply just transition and shut and flip the switch tomorrow will have a significant impact on those families across Canada. So it's not a simple solution. We need to take a parallel path, and the reason is because there's an insatiable demand for energy around the world, and it's not a question of whether it's fossil fuels or LNG or clean tech like wind and solar. Right now, that insatiable demand demands that it's all of the above. And so we need to take a parallel path, and we just can't flip the switch tomorrow and expect that it's not going to impact not just our economy, but the people in this country as well. So it is a complicated question, but we truly need to have a national conversation about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Broussard. Ms. North.
Yeah, so John is right. This is a very complicated problem, and that's why we need all hands on deck to deal with it. And so where are the young people here tonight? Can you raise your hands? So we do have a few, and oh, of course. Sorry. And I just want to tell you, and I want to tell your parents and your grandparents to go home and say this to you, that we adults are failing you. We politicians are failing you. When we talk about equivocating, when we're not setting targets, absolute targets for getting to zero emissions, then we're equivocating and we're not doing what you need us to do. So Greens have been the only political party in Canada's entire history that has consistently warned us about this crisis. And now we're all here at the table talking about it, thank God. But it's almost too late and we need to get to work. So I want to direct you to Mission Possible, which is our plan, 20 achievable and ambitious action steps to reach our goals. And go to our website, have a look. My son just met someone that he loves. And I hope that the two of them one day when they get married will plan to have children, but they might not. And I want to make sure that my son and his kids and you kids and your grandchildren and children after that inherit a livable planet. Let's go with what Nike says and let's just do it.
Thank you, Ms. North. Ms. Wilson.
Thanks. We are committed to phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies by 2025, and we are on track to do so. 8 out of 9 tax subsidies are already being phased out, but taking time to get this right makes sense. For example, one program identified as a subsidy helps support fuel costs for Indigenous communities that are still relying on diesel. Our Clean Power Fund will also help support the transition of northern, remote, and Indigenous communities to clean energy. And the new systems are up and running. That will support still, but the support still has a role to play. As a mother, I want to leave behind a healthy, prosperous climate for our kids, my kids, all of our kids. I was inspired by the millions of people who came together to march for climate action. That's why I'm proud to be part of a Liberal team that has set short, medium, and long-term goals to reduce our emissions. That's why our plan calls for legislation that can be enacted that requires us to meet our targets by 2050.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. We move on to the final preset question, number 6. And it's a local question about Lake Simcoe, from the Lake Simcoe Watch organization. According to the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan to improve water quality and protect our cold water fishery, the annual phosphorus loading must be reduced by 50% to 44 tons per year. Streams affected by runoff from urban, rural, and agricultural areas are responsible for more than half of Lake Simcoe's phosphorus loadings. The loss of woodlands, wetlands, and natural shorelines has led to increased phosphorus loadings into Lake Simcoe. Presently, the Government of Ontario's strategy does not include a specific plan for how to accomplish the reduction goal. Question: what will you do as an MP to ensure a reduction in Lake Simcoe's phosphorus loadings to 44 tons per year by 2026? And I'm going to start with Ms. Wilson, please.
Sorry?
Ms. Wilson.
You.
Okay. I just didn't.
Ms.
sorry.
Wilson, sorry.
The Liberal
Ms.
government
Thank you.
has been working with provinces and territories to protect the health of our lakes and watersheds. We are working with many stakeholders to build a cleaner and more prosperous future that will help Canadians save energy, reduce pollution, and safeguard our natural environment. I've heard from many voters that the cleanup of Lake Simcoe is a priority. If elected, I am committed to advocating to ensure that the necessary resources are allocated. I'm also excited to announce that we'll be making a formal announcement about what re-elected Liberal government will do. That's it.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. Ms. North.
So we Greens fully support reducing phosphorus loading to 44 tons per year by 2026 because water matters to us. It's sacred. Provincially, Greens have been demonstrating their commitment to water protection through, for example, the Paris-Galt Moraines Conservation Act. And in my other role as Deputy Leader of the Green Party of Ontario, I am so proud of Mike Schreiner, our first Green MPP and the leader of the Green Party of Ontario, because he is proving that Greens work across party lines to get these things done. And he has worked with all the parties and has managed to get the Paris-Galt Moraine Conservation Act successfully through its second reading and into committee at Queen's Park. So a Green government will ensure cooperation through the Council of Canadian Governments, and that again is the Indigenous, provincial, municipal, and federal governments working together. And we want to bring together inclusive policy making at the table. And we're proving that we do this, that we work across party lines in Ontario. We're proving it in PEI, we're proving it in New Brunswick, and we're proving it in British Columbia and in the House of Commons with our federal Greens. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. North. Mr. Broussard.
Thank you, Deb. At least 3 times in this document, A Real Plan for the Environment, it speaks specifically to Lake Simcoe. And I was pleased just over a week and a half ago to announce on the shores of Lake Simcoe that an elected Conservative government will restore the Lake Simcoe Cleanup Fund by investing $30 million over the next 4 years. And that will be a continuation of the close to $60 million that was invested in the previous 10 years, which was unfortunately not renewed, or as I would call it, canceled by the current Liberal government. There was 10 years of investment by stakeholders, 10 years of blood, sweat, and tears that was put into that lake that saw a measurable reduction in phosphorus, saw a measurable increase in fish and habitat, shoreline restoration, culvert restoration, and that investment needs to continue. And a Conservative government will do that, and we will continue to work, as we always did, with those stakeholders, the conservation authorities, and anybody who is invested in that lake and who loves that lake, to make sure that we continue the great work that was being done by the previous Lake Simcoe Cleanup Fund and restoring this current fund immediately after we get into government. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Broussard. Mr. Rainio.
Phosphorus loading has been an issue since I moved here in the 1990s, and I'm glad to see that phosphorus levels have been going down and moving in the right direction. However, we cannot be complacent. We need to ensure that new and existing water treatment plants maintain high standards for phosphorus. We need to continue the replacement of rural septic tanks with high-quality septic systems. We need to protect our wetlands in our watershed because wetlands are not insignificant. We need to protect green spaces in our watershed because green spaces are not insignificant. We need to put aside monies for communities to build the infrastructure to handle runoff, stormwater, and extreme weather events. We can't just throw money at this problem, however. We know how ecosystems work. We can't just look at our lake in isolation. We need to address climate change in its entirety, and that's why our bold action for climate change will support our efforts to protect our lake and reduce phosphorus levels in Lake Simcoe and our watershed.
Thank you, Mr. Rainio. Whew. Everybody take a breath. That was 42 minutes of a marathon.
That's good.
You will get a chance to clap, I promise. The next part of this debate is a little bit interesting. It's called the wild card. And I believe that Ms. Wilson might be ready with her wild card, which she is holding up here. And here's how this works for the benefit of our audience. You've just heard 6 preset questions, as we call them. 4 from the 100debates.ca, and 2 of them were local.
7 minutes short.
The candidates now, and they're simple rules, the wild card is optional. The candidates can use them or not. 1 wild card per candidate, 1 minute and 30 seconds rebuttal, limited to the 6 preset questions that you just heard. I believe that each of the candidates may be ready with a wild card. And you have a question, Ms.
Point
North.
of order.
Yes.
In the agenda, it says we have a 2-minute rebuttal.
I'm sorry, you're absolutely right. You have a 2-minute rebuttal. I gave you an extra 30 seconds.
Wonderful.
Isn't that good of me?
That was
I
really
thought
great.
you'd like that. We are on time, and I'm very happy. Thank you. So 2 minutes. Thank you for that point of order. Ms. Wilson, would you care to start? And again, this is to the 6 preset questions you've just heard, and you have 2 minutes, and your timing cards will indicate your timing.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's a shame we only have one of these, but anyway.
It's a shame you only have one. Yeah.
Okay, but I wanted to speak to the Lake Simcoe cleanup. Mr. Broussard said that it was canceled by the Liberals, which is an absolutely false statement. I have confirmed from the Propel committee member, actually the chair as well, Richard Simpson, that it was never canceled. It expired. And we had hoped that it would be renewed, but Harper wouldn't reinstate it because the election was only a few months away. And Trudeau didn't renew it at that time, as it was a Conservative who wasn't supporting it. However, I am committed, if elected, to do whatever I can to get, well, I was going to say with a re-elected Liberal government, to get that back and renewed and cleaned up.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. I think there's a wild card at the end here. Sorry.
Do we get a rebuttal or?
No, it's just one wild card, Mr. Broussard. I apologize. I believe Mr. Rainio had his card up first. Sure. One wild card rebuttal, please, Mr. Rainio. Go ahead.
I was just concerned about the answer from Mr. Broussard for question number 5 and his action plan for our local lake. He didn't seem to offer any steps to tackle climate change, and in his speech about technologies, he offered no targets or any timelines. So it just leaves me wondering, what if technologies don't end up saving us? It seems like the Conservative entire plan is based on a hope that technology will save us. We've heard that this magic bullet of technology will save us and we can continue on our way, and somewhere down the road we will be saved by technology. We can hope, but if it doesn't appear, I would be wondering what the Conservatives' plan B is, or do they have an alternative plan?
Thank you, Mr. Rainio. Mr. Broussard.
Thank you, Deb. Well, first of all, I'll address Mr. Rainio's, he's talking tonight about transitioning to technology. And the transition to technology, as I said earlier, technology, clean tech, only represents about 3% of our economy. So if you talk about a wing and a prayer, when again that insatiable demand for energy exists, not just here in Canada, but globally as well, I don't think it's responsible to be speaking about transitioning to technology or to discredit the transition to technology when that's the thing that Mr. Rainio is purporting to do. I will say on the Lake Simcoe Cleanup Fund, Justin Trudeau had a choice. He had a choice in 2017 to renew the Lake Simcoe Cleanup Fund, and it wasn't because there was a lack of effort on the part of the MPs that live in this area. Peter Van Loan led the charge. Bruce Stanton, Alex Nuttall, myself, and others were involved in the discussions, and we've asked the Minister of Environment and the Infrastructure Minister to renew this fund, and it was actually pushed off into other areas that were surprisingly Liberal-held ridings, including Lake Winnipeg and a riding in Quebec. So Justin Trudeau had a choice to continue on with the $60 million investment that all of you made in this lake, and he failed to act on that request.
Thank you, Mr. Broussard, and I believe everyone's chosen a wild card.
Yeah.
Ms. North.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
So in my 2 minutes, there's a number of things I want to go over. I want to just focus again on our Mission Possible plan. And it is a very detailed plan, and it is intended for us to work together within a cabinet of MPs from across the political spectrum, because once again, just like the Council of Canadian Governments, we will never get anything meaningful and long-lasting done until we work together and agree together on what the plan is. So please go to my website, bonnienorth.ca, or go to the greenparty.ca website, click on Mission Possible and have a look at it. And now I wanted to also talk about how we can mitigate some of the effects of climate change. And John is right. Farmers are there on the front lines dealing with this all of the time. So let's incentivize our farmers to do the work that they do already to build up our soil, because soil is an incredible bank where carbon can be sucked out of the air by plants and stored. And let's increase the protection of our forests and our wetlands, because again, they do these things, and maintain biodiversity, because biodiversity also helps mitigate climate change. And I also wanted to talk about pollution. When the Twin Towers went down in New York on 9/11, several different substances that were generally considered as safe got into the air and mixed together. So even when chemicals are approved by our government, we don't know what happens in our bodies because those first responders in 9/11 at Ground Zero developed cancers and diseases that were never seen before. We don't know what's happening, and we need to protect people from the approval of toxic substances. We don't even know they might be toxic until it's too late.
Thank you, Ms. North. Wow, we've got some great audience questions, and we're going to move into that segment now. This is a bit like popcorn. They have not, our candidates that is, have not heard these questions. I'm going to pose them, and they will have each 2 minutes to reply.
Okay.
And here's the question. Given the tremendous negative impacts animal agriculture is having on global depletion and the climate crisis, how will your party help animal-based farmers transition to plant-based farming? Do you need me to repeat that? Does anyone need it repeated? May I start with Mr. Rainio, please?
Certainly, and this would of course be optional for farmers. We cannot force farmers to move to plant-based farming. However, if farmers did like to make that transition, it would certainly help our planet and help our fight against greenhouse gas emissions. And we would be providing workers of all sorts and all fields, including farmers, with the necessary skills to make that transition to a new industry that helps our climate and reduces greenhouse gases. So those farmers could be assured of training and the proper resources they needed to make sure they transition to a plant-based farming society as needed.
Thank you, Mr. Rainio. Do you need the question repeated, Mr. Broussard?
No, I think I'm good.
Thank you.
Yeah. You know, I'll agree with Pekka that there's no way you can force farmers to transition into plant-based products. You know, that is something that if the market dictates and the market determines that that is a viable option for farmers in this country, then they will determine whether they're going to transition into that area. And so, you know, it certainly has to be an option, and there are more and more, and we're seeing it, farmers that are transitioning into plant-based options. But I will say, and I think it's something that needs to be addressed, is that, you know, the farmers are not the villains of society. They are out there producing on their land. They're producing not just crops, but also raising cattle and raising beef. And they're doing it, in many cases, for generations they've been doing it. And it's been passed on to the family farm. And the family farm is under threat at this point because of global prices. And it represents billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of people who work in agriculture. And we as a government need to support that. We as a community need to support that, because there's two things that a country needs. It needs food independence, and it needs energy independence. And we have to make sure that we support our farmers. And by supporting them, I don't mean protesting on their farms as they're trying to make a living because they raise beef, because they raise pork, and because they raise cattle. That's not what we do here in Canada. And if it's going to transition, the market will dictate whether that transitions or not.
Thank you, Mr. Broussard. Ms. North.
So John is right. We don't want to have people protesting on farmers' property because of what they grow or what they raise. But we can protest. We can protest with our dollars. We can protest with our behavior. My husband and I are almost vegan. We've been transitioning for a while, and we've done this not only for our health, but we've done it for the health of the planet. So plant-based diets not only save lives, but they save our environment. That said, let's talk about something we haven't mentioned at all, and that is how farming monoculture crops that are intended to feed only animals are taking up a disproportionate amount of our farmland. We are growing corn and soy in particular, in numbers that humans don't eat. The majority of these crops are grown to feed cattle. And worse, the reason why the Amazon is on fire right now is a direct line from the poor decision-making of the American government. The soy farmers in the United States have been shut out because of the tariff wars that Donald Trump has gotten into with China, opening up even bigger markets in South America. And then Bolsonaro, who is, I don't even know how to characterize him, he wants to destroy the Amazon. And so the big ag there is burning it down so they can sell soy to China to feed cattle. It's a direct line, and we need to stop it by voting with our dollars and making a statement.
Thank you, Ms. North. Ms. Wilson.
We have made historic investments with the farmers in helping them transition to cleaner methods. And if elected, I would listen to the farmers in Barrie and Innisfil and see what would help them best to be sustainable. Sorry. So I would definitely listen to the farmers here to find out what exactly would be best for them. But we have definitely made huge investments with our farmers to help them move to a cleaner methods. And like all the panels here, we can't force farmers into any one direction, but we definitely are here to support them. And like I said, I would be there as a voice to listen to them, to hear what it is that would help them most to go to a better sustainable method.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. Another excellent question from the audience, and thanks for playing along in this audience question period. How will your parties plan to integrate social justice into climate justice? Do you need it repeated? I'm going to start with Ms. North.
Okay. Climate issues are social justice issues. Social justice issues are environmental issues. We talked about Grassy Narrows. If we don't clean up the mercury in that river, we're going to continue to poison that group of Indigenous people that has been suffering now for decades. We need to also make sure that our oil and gas workers are transitioned in a just and fair way into green technologies. Green technologies around the world are a massive opportunity. Environmental justice and climate justice are also good for our bottom lines. They're good for prosperity. And so when we take advantage of that incredible opportunity, we can put our workers into sustainable jobs that are well-paying in their communities. We can also make sure, as we've mentioned tonight, to protect our land so that we can have a healthy environment. And unfortunately, whenever there is a problem with pollution, whenever there is a problem with extreme climate events, it is always the poorest people on Earth who are disproportionately affected by these things. And so when we don't look after things like our water, when we ignore the fact that the climate crisis is going on and we do business as usual, we are committing acts of environmental racism against our Indigenous peoples, and we are turning our backs on the people of the world who do not contribute to this, but get the results of it. So there's so many issues. Again, go to our website and have a look, and you'll see how our platform is geared towards social justice as well as climate justice.
Thank you, Ms. North. Mr. Broussard.
Thank you, Deb. Another terrific question, and I think the simple answer to that question is to provide opportunity for those who are marginalized in our society by making sure that there is opportunity for employment, opportunity to raise a family. And when we look at that opportunity and we relate it to the climate issue, Nowhere in this world is the extraction and the processing of natural resources more environmentally sustainable, with labor rights standards and human rights standards and innovation than here, right here in Canada. And one of the things that we need to remember is that we are buying 800,000 barrels a day of oil from Saudi Arabia. We are spending $22 billion a year to purchase that oil. Saudi Arabia, I'll remind you, doesn't have the same standards, labor, human rights, or environmental standards that we do, and they, in fact, persecute those for religious and sexual reasons. So if we're going to provide that hope and opportunity for people here in Canada, let's stop knocking down our natural resource sector. As I said earlier, 1.83 million people across this country work from coast to coast to coast, from Newfoundland to British Columbia, and Indigenous people as well work in that in that industry. So why are we continually knocking down our industry, and yet on the other hand we're purchasing this type of activity that we produce here in a clean and environmentally sustainable way from Saudi Arabia as well? It doesn't make any sense. It does not make any sense.
Thank you, Mr. Broussard. Ms. Wilson.
Thank you. There is no simple answer to this. I do agree with Ms. North that we do all need to come together on these issues. I personally know what it's like to work on the front lines and to advocate for change, to advocate for transparency, to advocate for accountability, and definitely social injustice, and it goes hand in hand with the environment. Bonnie said it well there with about, that was a great term, with the environmental discrimination. So like I said, there's no simple answer, but it was one thing that we do need to come together and have a voice and be a strong voice and continue to advocate for these issues and for all the people that are impacted by that. And I am very, very familiar with doing this and confident doing it, and I have no issues with being an advocate.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. Mr. Rainio.
Yes, climate change affects the poor disproportionately. Oil pipelines won't be going through Mr. Broussard's backyard or Ms. Wilson's backyard. They go through the communities of the poor. Toxins and pollutants affect the poor disproportionately as well. If you've ever been to Hamilton and driven near the Stelco plant and you've seen people living right underneath the overpasses beside the Stelco plant, you know that they are stuck there because of poverty. We need to both address climate change and inequality together. Neither of them can be solved in isolation. You know, our transition to a low-carbon future, we know that every dollar spent on renewable energy resource sector nets 7 times as many jobs as the fossil fuel sector. The fossil fuel sector is slowly disappearing. The renewable sector is where investors are putting all of their money. This is an area where we need to continue to support and to get clean, well-paying jobs for Canadians across the country. We also need to be supporting labor rights, and I hope all parties up here will support the $15 minimum wage that we are proposing for all federal workers. And Mr. Broussard spoke very passionately about purchasing oil from Saudi Arabia. I hope that the Conservatives will be so passionate as well as about stopping the sales of arms to Saudi Arabia. So if we're talking about social justice, we need to be talking about all peoples across Canada and across the planet.
Thank you, Mr. Rainio. The third question is about climate change. Not surprising. Climate change is the biggest issue of this century. All citizens must help reduce emissions. What would your party do to help us do more? I'm going to start with Ms. Wilson. Does anyone need that repeated?
Yes, please.
One more time. Climate change is the biggest issue of the century. All citizens must help reduce emissions. What would your party do to help us do more? Ms. Wilson.
Thanks. We've seen pollution pricing work in the EU, California, Quebec, BC, and around the world. And it's helped us stop smog and acid rain. Using prices to change behavior just makes sense. If the price of something goes up, you think twice about buying it. So if the price of pollution goes up, you look for cleaner options. If you've ever bought something on sale, then you know price signals work. And Andrew Scheer wants to make price pollution free again. We have designed a system that cuts pollution from heavy industry while protecting competitiveness. The approach we're using is widely recognized as best practice, and we're investing $1.4 billion of carbon pricing revenues over the next 5 years in helping small business cut pollution and save energy costs. All revenues from carbon pricing go back to Canadian families, communities, and small businesses. 8 out of 10 families will be better off, and this has been confirmed by the Independent Parliamentary Budget Office. Lower and middle income families stand to benefit along with families that take action to cut pollution. The bigger picture is we can't afford not to cut pollution and fight climate change. The enormous costs of floods, fires, storms, plus the impact on people's health.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. Ms. North?
So we experience the effects of climate change at the local level. We are already doing it. Every time there is an extreme weather event, that is somehow tied into the climate trends and the climate change. So we want to help our municipalities by boosting up their water infrastructure to climate-proof drinking water, because every time there's some kind of weather catastrophe, our water is at stake. We also want to help people specifically, and I'll read some items from our Mission Possible. We want to green our grid. By 2030, we want to remove all fossil fuel generation from our national east-west electricity grid, and we want to modernize it. So by 2030, we want to rebuild and revamp the east-west electricity grid to ensure that renewable energy can be transmitted from one province to another. And we want to plug into electric vehicles. By 2030, we want to ensure that all new cars are electric, and we can do that by incentivizing the purchase of them, and also by making sure that auto manufacturers are incentivized to build those vehicles in our communities and in our country and give jobs to auto workers. Instead of what the Ford government has been doing is disincentivizing them so that they're moving away. We also want to modernize our Via Rail so that railway travel is something we can do again, and we also need to build walkable and livable communities. It's ridiculous that Innisfil does not have an intercity bus service. You can't even get to the GO station on a bus. That's insane. We also want to complete a national building retrofit where we can create millions of new well-paying jobs in the trades by retrofitting every building in Canada, residential, commercial, and institutional, to be carbon neutral by 2050. There's much more, and again, please go to our website. We can show you how we will pay for that in our costed budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. North. Mr. Brassard.
Thank you, Deb. And in fact, the Liberals did put a price on pollution. They put a carbon tax on pollution, and right now that carbon tax stands at $20 per ton. The Parliamentary Budget Officer, who Lisa referred to, says that in order for Canada to meet its Paris targets, or even come close to its Paris targets, that carbon tax would have to rise to $102 per ton, which represents about a 5-fold increase. There is an affordability issue for Canadians right now. Many Canadians are feeling affordability anxiety, and what that represents at $102 per ton is roughly about 23 cents a litre on the price of fuel increase. So for those of us who live here in Barrie-Innisfil and commute down to Toronto and Mississauga and other places, it disproportionately affects those that live in this area. If you live in a city like Toronto with a large mass transit system, it works well for you. But those families here in Barrie-Innisfil who are feeling that affordability anxiety are going to be disproportionately affected. Now, what Conservatives will do is we'll offer incentives for people to do things like a home renovation tax credit, which could mean up to $3,800 for people who want to replace their windows, who want to replace their insulation, who want to put solar panels on their roof to do their part in the fight against climate change. But it's costing people in this area disproportionately, and many people want to contribute to the fight against climate change, but they don't want to pay a price for that. That's the reality of the situation, and the increase in a carbon tax puts at a very threat the economic sustainability of families here in Barrie-Innisfil, because it does affect them disproportionately.
Thank you, Mr. Broussard. Mr. Rainio.
If we truly want to see real climate action, we need to address inequality as well as climate change. So we need everyone on board, all hands on deck. So that means we need to put in place programs like our $15 minimum wage for federal workers. We need a pharmacare program so people aren't struggling to pay their medications. We need to build 500,000 new homes over the course of the next 10 years and retrofit older homes so that they are not contributing to our climate change greenhouse gases. We do need a price on carbon. Economists agree that this is the best way to change our habits. Now, the price on carbon is interesting because people will choose companies who invest in reducing their greenhouse gases, because companies that do invest in greenhouse gases, they will be charged less. They will be paying less for greenhouse gas emissions. Their products will be cheaper. So we will be able to choose companies that have invested in greenhouse gases, and this is a cycle that will continue and help limit greenhouse gas emissions. You know, we need to build the infrastructure to transition to a low-carbon future, and this means lots of good-paying jobs. Retrofitting houses means good-paying jobs. Training workers and building the infrastructure needed for electric vehicles and all of the energy transmission that we need in our society to move to a low-carbon future. So we need to address inequality as well as climate change.
Thank you, Mr. Rainio. We're going to try and fit in more than 4 questions because we have a little bit of extra time and there's some excellent audience questions here. We're going to give them a break, just give them a quick break for water, catch their breath, and I will read this next question. We will all need to keep reducing our emissions and use of fossil fuels in the coming years. What new ideas will you bring to your respective caucuses that are not currently in your platforms? I'll repeat that last part. What new ideas will you bring to your respective caucuses that are not currently in your platforms? Bit of pie in the sky. I'd like to start with Ms. North, please.
Well, this is a subject that's actually very close to my heart. I am a registered nutritional consultant, and as I mentioned before, I believe in working toward farming practices that happen inside our cities and beyond our cities that are climate friendly. And I've been volunteering with an organization in Barrie called the Urban Pantry, which supports peri-urban and suburban farming. I also have a fully organic set of gardens in my property because I believe in building up the soil, I believe in feeding people, and then where I'm not growing food, I'm also growing food and shelter for wildlife. My pie in the sky idea is to look at agriculture through a national food strategy that deals with the challenges that farmers face, that deal with the challenges that we will have as we become an increasingly urbanized society. And do we really want to keep transporting food from California and Florida and places? We need to have a strategy to make sure that our farmers and our urban farmers can grow food for all of us. So that is my pie in the sky. And I would like to also add that that national food strategy would also deal, although it's not a climate issue, with a national school food strategy as well. When we have children going to school hungry, and not every school or jurisdiction makes sure that they have a breakfast program or a lunch program, we need to address that. That is a wrong that we can right. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. North. Mr. Broussard.
Thank you, Deb. Part of my responsibility in my role in Parliament as Deputy Whip is stakeholder outreach, and I've had a lot of opportunities over the last 4 years to meet with innovators, technology, innovators, clean tech innovations as well. And one of the things that we need to do, and despite the fact that it's in our platform, I believe in this, is to provide the incentives to those people who are creating the green technology of the future. And I'll give you an example. I met with one company down in Oakville, and they're producing a single combustion engine that weighs just 24 pounds. It reduces greenhouse gas or carbon emissions by about 90%. But it does provide 270 horsepower of a push for an automobile. Now think about this, a traditional 4 to 6 cylinder car, this vehicle has the opportunity to revolutionize the way vehicles drive, not just here in North America, but around the world. So by working with companies like that who are struggling at this commercialization stage and providing them with low tax incentives so that they can put that money more into research and development, more into the production of their program, will really help them. But most importantly, I think, is putting the weight of the Canadian government behind them through our Canadian Clean Initiative, where we can export that type of technology, not just use it domestically, but also export it around the world so that we can help those car manufacturers who are producing those type of cars think about that option that is existing today in Oakville, Ontario. And so we have a real opportunity here to work with innovators and help them to not just get through the patent process of their development stage, but also to commercialize and help them move those products around the world.
Thank you, Mr. Broussard. Mr. Rainio.
Earlier this year, I ran a town hall, a climate change event town hall in June at the Holly Rec Center, and it was open to everyone, but I was really trying to encourage young people to attend because young people are passionate about climate change. They want opportunities to have leadership roles. And so perhaps this is a place where we can, in our government, give young people more of a leadership role. If we're thinking about future pie-in-the-sky ideas, maybe we can figure out a way for young people to be at the table as we move forward to a low-carbon future. They would enjoy the opportunity, and I'm sure they would have many good, innovative ideas. And of course, young people always come with passion and enthusiasm that we can all learn from. The second thing is to help fund tech innovation companies like the Mars Innovation Center in downtown Toronto. This is an innovation company that's run by the government, paid by the government, although it's really for small businesses to have startups and create innovative products. So we do need to look at new technologies, and the Mars Center in downtown Toronto is a good model, and we need to keep funding those kind of models to help us transition quickly to a low-carbon future.
Thank you, Mr. Rainio. Ms. Wilson.
That was a great question, and I agree with Mr. Rainio. Young people, they are a great wealth and resource. I'd love to say that I, have some wonderful new idea. However, I don't. But what I do enjoy is going to the doors and listening to the people. And I welcome anyone to even come see me after if they have some great ideas, because that's what I'm good at doing, is listening and taking your thoughts and your concerns and making them heard in Ottawa, where things can get done. So, like I said, young people, I'm sure, young, old, and maybe whoever even asked that question, maybe you have something kind of going in your mind, and that's why you posed that question. So Absolutely. I'm here to listen and advocate, and so for sure after, if anyone has anything they want to add or they've got some idea they want to share, I'd really love to hear from you.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. This one is near and dear to those of us who live in the Barrie-Innisfil area. What is your plan for keeping water in the public domain? I repeat, what is your plan for keeping water in the public domain? I'm going to start with Mr. Rainio, please.
Thank you. We have problems with keeping water in the public domain around our province. Companies like Nestle are draining some of the aquifers in order to make huge profit, and we are only charging companies like Nestle a few dollars for every 1,000 liters they pull. So we need to prevent the privatization of water here in Ontario, and we need to increase the fees charged if companies are pulling water. We also need to make sure that this isn't happening in other countries. We shouldn't be supporting the privatization of water in other countries around the world.
Thank you, Mr. Rainio. Ms. North.
So I mentioned it earlier, we're already proving our commitment to making sure our water is a public good. Mike Schreiner, as I said, managed to get the Paris Gulf Moraine bill into committee at in Queen's Park, and we believe, as Pekka said, around the world globally, we should all be advocating and fighting against the privatization of water everywhere. I really don't have that much to build on this. As I've said, water is a human right, and we deserve to keep our water, which is again a wealth that is shared by all of us, owned by all of us, and not put into bottles and sold outside of our province and around the world.
Thank you. Ms. Wilson.
I agree completely with Ms. North. Hopefully our single ban plastic will help with that, but absolutely, you know, I can't really add more to that other than, yes, we need to protect our water, and we need to come together, all of us, to ensure that we do that.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. Mr. Broussard.
Well, those of us that live and love living around Lake Simcoe understand the importance of water and what it means to not just our local economy, but also to our livelihoods. There are many people that are employed as a result of Lake Simcoe and the recreation dollars that it creates. It really is an economic driver for our area. But on the issue of privatization of water, there is a simple solution to this, and that is to change your habits. Change your habits. If there's no demand for bottled water, then companies won't be able to sell it. And so, you know, when we talk about the privatization of water, every one of us has an obligation. And I know during the campaign, my campaign director made it very clear right from the start that there will be no bottled water, Nestle or otherwise, in our office. And we use containers of water, and we have a big jug that we have that we fill up, and that's what we do. So, you know, the demand for water will not exist if we change our habits, and there's been examples all over whether it's recycling and the job that we've done with recycling. Change your habits, and the demand won't be there. And if there's no demand, then there's no sales, and these companies will not be selling water, at least here in Canada or locally in Barrie-Innisfil.
Thank you, Mr. Broussard. This is the 6th audience question, and they're really great. No surprise, this one is about climate change. Given how large the problem of climate change is, can we totally rely on only technological solutions? Can we totally rely on only technological solutions? I'm going to start with Ms. Wilson, please.
That's a great question. I believe there's all kinds of components that we need to use, like we are planting 2 billion trees to help with keeping carbon. So I don't think we can rely strictly on technology. We have to look at all options, our behaviors, what we do, you know, each and every day. So to best answer that, I say no. I think it's a combination of many things, and like I said, all of us coming together and you know, brainstorming things that we that will be best for our planet moving forward.
Thank you. Did anyone need me to repeat the question?
Please.
Given how large the problem of climate change is, can we totally rely on only technological solutions?
Okay.
Ms. North.
So I don't think we can totally rely on any one particular solution. We need an entire toolbox of solutions to choose from in order to deal with this huge problem that we have. And let's just talk about technology for a second. Carbon capture technology is extremely expensive. It's also extremely energy intensive to run. And a molecule, like a ton of carbon, is huge. It's absolutely huge. And so in order for us to pull carbon out of the air through carbon capture technology, we don't have the technology right now to make it a viable single option. But we do have some incredible technological options like electric vehicles, like railway. Electrifying our railways would make a huge difference. But then, again, it's not the only solution. Lisa Marie talked about growing trees. I agree, we need to grow trees because they're extremely efficient at pulling carbon out of the air and sequestering it in their tissues and in the ground. But we can't just plant trees. We have to protect the forest that exists right now, because we are engaging in deforestation that is completely changing and reversing the effects of planting trees. We also need to look at our farming practices and encourage farmers to have biodiverse farms, not monoculture farms. There are so many ways that alive and living soil can sequester carbon. There's so many things I could go on, but technology is not the only solution. We need many solutions.
Thank you, Ms. North. Mr. Broussard.
Thank you. And technology is one part of the solution for mitigating the impacts of climate change. There's adaptation, there's conservation, there's managing our wetlands, better understanding of the challenges of air pollution, protecting our waterways, reinstating and improving conservation project funding. There are a whole litany of things that we can do to mitigate the impacts of climate change. As I said at the onset, this is not a one-party solution. This is a multiple-party solution. It's a countrywide solution. I go back to the words of Frank McKenna and the former Liberal Premier of New Brunswick when he said, we truly have to have, and it doesn't occur always during an election time, but a national conversation, a national outlook on what we need to do as Canadians to come together to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And when we do that and we look at the options that are available, whether it's technological, whether it's conservation or other methods, we also have to understand the implications of that. And that's precisely what Mr. McKenna was talking about. And so I would hope that whoever forms the next government, if it's us, I will certainly be pushing for this national conversation. Maybe we need a parliamentary committee, a special parliamentary committee to look at the impacts of these so that the ideas of the NDP and the Conservatives, the Greens and the Liberals and others can come together to talk about how we as a country are not just going to continue to do our part, and we're punching well above our weight in this country, but also help in the fight for global climate change as well, and help other countries mitigate the impacts that they're having on global climate change. This is something that we all need to come together on.
Thank you, Mr. Broussard. Mr. Rainio.
I guess the question is, can we count on technology to save the day? No. We can change behaviors, we can put in place incentives and hope that there's some technological breakthroughs, but government needs to lead the way. We need a national response to the climate crisis. We need to put in place standards, regulations, tough targets, and tight timelines. We need a government with a vision to lead the change in the next decade. Otherwise, it's just a lot of talk and a lot of consultation and nothing gets done because we just stall, stall, stall. We need to put in concrete timelines and regulations and targets and move on those timelines. We've had plenty of time to talk. The scientists have given us the path forward. We have the technology to move. We just need the political will, and I hope after October 21st we have a party that will lead Canada in this change over the next decade.
Thank you, Mr. Rainio. I know it's hard. I know it's hard, folks. Do you think we can fit in one more question? Okay. They're really great, and thank you for all the work that you have done. This one, not surprisingly, is also on climate change with a twist. And I'm going to ask if you just give me a 1-minute response, please. We're coming down to the end of this debate. Here's the question. What actions do you personally take to fight climate change? And I'll repeat, what actions do you personally take to fight climate change? I'm going to start with Mr. Rainio.
I can think of 2 actions right off the bat. I carpool, and I've been carpooling for years. So we were trying to reduce our use of the automobile because we know that transportation is a large emitter of greenhouse gas. I try to bicycle as much as I can to events locally and wherever I need to go. We know that transportation, again, causes lots of greenhouse gas emissions. I try to limit my air travel because we know air travel is also another big greenhouse gas emitter. My wife and I try to move to vegetarian meals as much as possible. It's not always possible, but we try to do that as much as we can. We don't use bottled water, and as a teacher, I run a lot of environmental training and workshops for our children at schools and my own kids, and we try to instill an appreciation for nature and a need to tackle climate change. And I'm running to be your MP because I feel that climate change is our #1 issue, and I hope to be a strong voice in Ottawa to bring about a climate change plan that will actually work over the next 10 years.
Thank you, Mr. Rainio. Mr. Broussard.
Thank you. And obviously we try to carpool as much as we can. I know going back and forth to Ottawa is awfully difficult because there are options that are available between flying and driving. I choose to drive back and forth to Ottawa because I also, the limitations on aircraft travel and getting stuck and canceled and all of that stuff. But I'm actually looking forward to our green home renovation tax credit kicking in because I need a new furnace. My furnace is aging and it's not functioning properly. I know my wife and I, obviously the cost of heating and electricity, we try to keep the lights off, which burns less power. Furnace, we try to keep the temperature at a reasonable level, not just from an air conditioning standpoint, but also from a heating standpoint. So again, I mean, there are certain things that we do personally in order to mitigate the impacts of climate change, and we're going to continue to do that. Recycling, although it doesn't have an impact on climate change, I can tell you that probably, well, it would actually, because of the plastics and all that stuff that's manufactured. We are at least 90% of our home consumables we recycle on a weekly basis, and we're very conscious of that as well. And again, I go back to recycling because you think of where we were with recycling as a society and how it's evolved to a point where it is now. We will be changing. All of us are cognizant and aware of those habits that we're creating, whether it's driving, carpooling, or other situations. But it is difficult as the current member of Parliament to take transit from here to one place to another because of the demands on the schedules. But carpooling is one thing that we look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Broussard. Ms. North.
Well, so I talked about my husband and I transitioning to veganism, and we're near vegans now. We unfortunately can't afford yet an electric vehicle, so we're looking forward to the day when it's incentivized better and we can afford an electric vehicle. Right now our old clunker is paid off, and economically we've got to keep with it for a couple more years. But when it comes to travel, I choose as conveniently as possible, and there's the caveat, I choose to use Barrie Transit, and I'm going to tell you, it is not convenient. Our transit systems, yes, our transit systems are appalling. They're appalling inside our cities. They're appalling between our cities. They're appalling across the province. And John's right. If he has to drive, then we're doing something wrong. We should be building up our transit systems so it's easier for people to get around. Somebody said when the Liberals started talking about the Canadarm or something like that for NASA, she said, I don't care about something going on in space. I just want to be able to take a bus to visit my grandma. So. I talked about our urban garden. I've talked about I garden for wildlife as well. And if every single one of us did that, we could create wildlife corridors in our cities. There's so much we could do. There's so much I am doing. I could sit here all night and list it, but that doesn't mean that I'm perfect. This is a journey, and we're all on this journey, and we're working together to be better.
Thank you, Ms. North. Ms. Wilson.
I'm from a generation where this was not the issue at hand. And so I am glad to say that one of the things that I am doing is I am becoming way more informed on how important climate change is. My children are of that generation, and they are always there to remind me if needed. But I have, you know, the same thing, no plastic water bottles. I'm really not a fan of driving, and actually, way back when, one of my favorite cars that came out was the Tesla. Unfortunately, I can't afford that either, but I would have gladly go to an electric vehicle. So I am doing my best, same I would imagine as most people, recycle, composting. But I think the most important thing that we can do is educate ourselves and continue to educate ourselves, because some people don't think that this is an issue, and it's a huge issue. And when I say that generation, I'll say it, I was born in the 70s. I mean, it wasn't happening then. So, you know, not in my home. So I am proud to say that I have become way more informed, and I think that's the best thing that everybody can do, is to understand what's really going on, what's happening to our planet, and do our best coming together to fight climate change as one race.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. We have some extra time. I buffered in here just in case the candidates went over time. And in fact, they've been really good tonight. So here's what I'd like to do, with the approval of the candidates, that is. I'd like to introduce a second wild card. There was great disgruntlement when I said there was only one. And I wonder if the candidates are willing to take a second wild card and take 2 minutes to rebut any of the 6 preset questions. I'm going to give them a second to breathe, take a little bit of water, and think about this. I'm springing it on them, rather than continue to ask audience questions in the spirit of a true debate, which often involves quite a bit of rebuttal. I'm going to ask the candidates if they would like to use the wild card or would like to use audience questions. What say you, candidates? Wild card?
I'm reviewing the questions, actually, because they were so long ago.
It's been a marathon. I appreciate that, Mr. Broussard. So of the 6 preset questions that were asked, if you have copies, and I believe you have copies, were there any rebuttals?
Deb,
Were there any rebuttals?
I don't have a rebuttal.
No rebuttals? Mr. Rainio, no rebuttals? Anyone else wanting to use one?
And Lisa Marie needs the question.
And Lisa Marie needs the question. So we could probably put those up again, or we can move on to audience questions, because I have 2 more audience questions. 2 more really great audience questions. What would you like to do, ladies?
I'm flexible.
Audience questions, I believe. Audience questions it is. Thank you. The audience worked really hard for these tonight, so thank you for the flexibility from our candidates. And thank you for these questions. Here's the first one. Actually, the 8th one, if anyone's counting. Should the carbon tax be increased or decreased? I'll repeat that. Should the carbon tax be increased or decreased? I'm going to start with Ms. Wilson.
So first of all, we have put a price on pollution. So the biggest polluters pay the biggest price. And that in turn gets reinvested back and rebated to Canadians. So I feel that that is something that's worked. It's worked around the world, and it's working for us. And the independent parliamentary, as I mentioned before, says 8 out of 10 families do benefit from that, and those families are the lower and middle income families that, and the families that are, being green, that actually benefit from that. So I think the system we have in place is good. If there isn't a price, private business and corporations won't. I mean, they'll always choose profit over, pollution. So I think that, it being charged to the biggest polluters is the best way to go.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. And to be specific, this is a 1-minute response, please. Thank you. My apologies to our timers. Ms. North, should the carbon tax be increased or decreased?
Well, I think it should be gradually increased because the carbon tax or pollution pricing or whatever you want to call it actually does drive behavior. And it's not exactly true that the most impoverished people among us are disproportionately affected by it because, quite frankly, they are using vehicles less. Their carbon footprint is lower. So proportionately, they are getting more money back from a carbon neutral pollution pricing plan. And I've got an interesting thing to tell you about. An Abacus poll looked and asked the question, how expensive is the carbon tax in your life? And 82% of people said it was significantly affecting their lifestyle. Of those people, 52% were conservatives, and then they found out that the that the carbon tax hadn't even been implemented. It was implemented 2 weeks into the future. So there's a lot of misinformation out there, and we need to question some of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. North. Mr. Broussard,
Thank you,
1 minute,
Deb.
please.
The carbon tax should be scrapped, and there should be no carbon tax. And I'll tell you why. And Lisa speaks about exemptions. The largest polluters in this country are getting 90% exemptions from the carbon tax. And the reason why they're getting those exemptions is because the Liberal government understood the impact that it was going to have on business. It's having a significant impact on small businesses. But at the end of the day, who pays for it? Consumers pay for it. And if the purpose of a carbon tax is to change habits, somebody needs to answer this question for me. If I'm paying $100 a year in carbon tax and I'm getting $100 back, how is that going to change my habits? What is the incentive for me to change my habits? Soccer moms, hockey families, those who are driving down to Mississauga or Markham from Barrie-Innisfil are disproportionately being affected by this carbon tax. And when there's an affordability anxiety that already exists, we know that 48% of Canadians are $200 away from insolvency, 26% can't meet their monthly obligations. The carbon tax impacts families here in Barrie-Innisfil.
Thank you, Mr. Broussard. Mr. Rainio.
The Conservatives seem to have a habit of wanting to kill all these plans that will help affect climate change. They killed cap and trade here in Ontario, and now they want to kill a carbon tax across the country. Hey, if we want carbon tax to be effective, it will need to be increased regularly and predictably, and the rebate that people get for the carbon tax should go along with that increase. As the carbon price goes up, your rebate should go up. It must be revenue neutral.
Thank you, Mr. Rainio. We're coming into the final few minutes of the debate, and I thank you all for your patience. We're going to ask the candidates to please wrap up with 2 minutes each. So this is their final comments for the debate, the concluding remarks. And I am going to start with Mr. Broussard, please.
Thank you. And I really appreciate the fact that this debate was on tonight, and I appreciate all of you taking the time to come here. I also appreciate the questions that were asked, and for those who are watching this being streamed on Rogers, I say thank you for your attention to this matter, and it is an important matter. There's no question about that. And as I said earlier, all of us have to come together in order to work together to mitigate the impacts that climate change and man-made climate change is having on not just our Canadian society, but also our global village as well. And I want to reemphasize the fact that there is no monopoly on a good idea. And I think that we have to work together in order to make sure that the ideas that are presented, the ideas that are expressed, and are properly administered, but we also have to understand. And I think it would be naive of us to not understand the implications, not just on the climate, but also the implications on Canadians and Canadian businesses as well. And so it's not an easy discussion. It's not there's no easy solution to this. And as I look in the audience and I see people like Mr. Sid Lucas here, and I know a teacher at Bear Creek Secondary School, and Sid and I have had many, many conversations over the last 4 years about this issue. And there are many things that we agree on, and there are many things that we don't agree on. There is no simple solution to this, but the need for us to all work together is paramount in order to not just talk about the environmental sustainability of our Earth, of our local watersheds, and certainly Lake Simcoe has been highlighted tonight as great importance, but also the economic sustainability of our country. We have to balance both, and we can't forsake one for the other, and that's the unfortunate reality that we face. We will get there. We're just not there yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Broussard. Ms. North, 2 minutes, please.
So I think most of us in this room can agree that climate change is the biggest existential threat that we're facing locally, nationally, and around the world. And it affects us across all economic sectors, all levels of government. And the federal government in particular needs to catch up. And our solutions need to be more than simple one-shot things. They need to be comprehensive. And so we've talked about the Council of Canadian Governments. We've also talked about the Cabinet of Intergovernments, where MPs across all political spectrums get together and work on this problem. And you know, even though we understand the threat that we're facing, despite that today, someone at a debate I was at earlier said that climate change is a hoax and implied that for us to take aggressive action against it is economic suicide. And it was really disappointing to have one of the candidates say, essentially agree, and imply that our efforts to attack this would be over-politicizing the issue. So to suggest climate change is anything but an emergency rooted in science betrays our values and betrays our children. And it's those forces of ignorance and inaction which are our greatest threat. This election means the difference between 4 years of progress towards seizing the opportunities of green technology or 4 destructive years of more pipelines, carbon subsidies, and deadly years of inaction. And for decades, we Greens have been clanging the bell, we've been banging the drum and sounding the alarm, and finally everyone is listening. So the best time to act against climate change was 50 years ago. The next best time is now. Please vote Green, because we are on that track.
Thank you, Ms. North. Thank you. Hold your applause, please. Ms. Wilson.
Thank you. There's a lot of information today that I have with regards to what the Liberals have done and what we plan to do. And with our time frame with questions, I tried not to be wordy or have little anecdotes and just wanted to get right to the facts so that I could give you as much of the information in the short amount of time. There was a reaction when I said my generation and you know, not knowing much about this. And it's true. I went to school, born and raised in Toronto, and this wasn't something that we were being taught in schools. And I don't know anybody here who was taught this in their schools. So just wanted to respond to that. And like I said, the Liberals have done more in the last years to fight climate change than any other federal government in Canada history. And like I said, lots more has to be done. So thank you again for coming and sharing your concerns. I have listened and I'm committed to fighting climate change and protecting our Earth. Experts say the Conservative plan will do less and cost more. We have all witnessed or have been directly or indirectly impacted by climate change, like our farmers, crops being destroyed by drought, parents who can't let their kids outdoors because the air quality is so poor from wildfires, our seniors stuck in their homes for days because of heat waves, or workers who can't make it to work because the highway is washed out. We have a plan to fight climate change that's ambitious and serious. We have 50+ measures in all parts of the economy to cut pollution, adapt to the consequences of climate change, create jobs, and clean growth. And we will do more for Barrie-Innisfil. This October 21st, choose Ford and vote for me, Lisa Marie Wilson.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. Mr. Rainio.
Thank you. Hey, our climate change plan follows the lead of Naomi Klein. We cannot tackle climate change in isolation. We must tackle climate change and inequality together to get a real transition to a low-carbon future. Otherwise, it's just greenwashing and slow incremental change. The Conservatives have no real climate change plan. There's no targets, no timelines, no funding. It's 2019. It's outrageous that they have no plan to address the concerns of so many people across our country. I hope the Conservatives realize the extreme cost of inaction. The Liberals profess to want to fix climate change. They declare a climate crisis one day, and the next day they buy a pipeline. I'll leave it up to you to decide on their credibility. Ms. North and I are both strong climate activists in our riding. We have similar goals and targets, but I don't think you can tackle climate change in isolation. We must tackle climate change and a host of other problems under the umbrella of climate, and that includes inequality and systemic racism. I've been knocking on many doors for the last 2 months, and what I hear at the door and what people are saying is that in this upcoming election on October 21st, it's going to be either the Conservatives or the NDP. This is what happened in the provincial election a year ago. The NDP, and I was the candidate, we doubled the votes of the Liberals and the Greens combined, and I see that same pattern happening around the election this time. I'm hoping that everyone will rally behind the NDP because we need to flip the seat so we can have real climate change action and that we can have a strong voice in Ottawa after October 21st. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rainio. An event of this size and complexity can't be accomplished without the support and cooperation of a host of people. And I think we need to thank our guest candidates tonight. What they did tonight was a marathon, not a sprint. Please help me congratulate them. Now's the time to clap. With just a couple of minutes left, please help me thank the following people. And if they'll stand when I speak their names, I'd appreciate it. Adam Bala, Simcoe County Greenbelt Coalition. Woo! For his wit, his wisdom, and all his work. Catherine Schutzen, Community Engagement Manager right here in this house at Idea Lab and Library, for her tireless effort to bring together this team. Jen Murley, Community Engagement Coordinator here, deserves special mention for her energy and enthusiasm. Thanks also to Wilf Steimel for getting the posse together. all the library staff and volunteers, and I see the CAO here this evening, Aaron Scucciamari. Thank you, Aaron, for letting us use this house. Ross Pittick, and volunteer for timing this event, which is not easy to do. Well done. Well done. And I believe there are other Nantyre Shores student volunteers in the house tonight, so please stand and take a wave. Thank you. I also want to thank all the Rogers TV staff that were here tonight. They arrived at 3:30 to set up, to make this live streaming possible, to make this experience possible. There were a lot of people involved. Most especially, I want to thank each of you for your presence, for your questions, and they were great. I wished we could have fit in more, and for this commitment to the debate. The final reminder, because I think I'm almost there, I'm almost out of time, is to get out on October the 21st and vote. Please vote. Thank you for attending 100 Debates on the Environment. There is an opportunity to meet the candidates afterward if you'd like to stay around. I think the house here is open for a little bit longer, Aaron. And thank you so much. Good night, everyone. Safe travels.